There's a specific silence that comes right before your entire life cracks open. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet Tuesday morning where everything still looks normal and nothing ever will be again. I've thought about that silence every single day for 3 years. I've replayed it obsessively, forensically, the way you keep pressing a bruise just to confirm it still hurts. And it always does. What I'm about to tell you isn't a story about anger. It's a story about what happens to a person when the one human being they trusted completely turns out to have been the most dangerous decision they ever made. My name is Elliot Marsh, and the man who destroyed me was the closest thing I ever had to a brother. Part 1. The kind of friendship people don't believe in anymore. I want you to understand something before I go any further, because I think it matters. I think it matters more than any of the betrayal, more than any of the revenge, more than the satisfying ending I'm going to give you eventually. What Damien Correa and I had was real. It wasn't the casual, surface-level friendship that most adults resign themselves to after 30. It wasn't the kind of relationship you maintain through Christmas cards and occasional group chats. What we had was the kind of bond that forms when two people go through the fire together young enough that it leaves a permanent mark on both of them. We met at 17 during the worst summer of my life. My parents had just divorced. Messily, loudly, in the way that financially comfortable people divorce when they have enough money to afford lawyers who are paid specifically to make the other person suffer. My mother moved us to a rental house in a neighborhood I didn't know, in a city I barely recognized anymore, and I started my junior year of high school knowing absolutely no one. I was the kind of teenager who'd spent years building a social structure, a core friend group, a reputation, a sense of where I stood, and in one summer, all of it evaporated. I was invisible in a way that felt suffocating. Damien sat next to me in AP chemistry on the first day of school because it was the only open seat. He had this quality even then, this easy, magnetic confidence that wasn't arrogance, wasn't performance. He was just genuinely at ease with himself in a way that I found almost baffling. He looked over at my notebook where I'd been organizing the periodic table by properties because I didn't know what else to do with my hands, and he said, completely seriously, "You know, if you group the transition metals by electron configuration instead of period, the patterns you see in reaction behavior are actually more predictive, but your color coding is impressive." I looked up. He was smiling, but not mockingly. "I'm Damien," he said. We talked for the entire class period. The teacher reprimanded us twice. By the time the bell rang, something had already shifted between us. That rare, immediate recognition that you found someone who operates on a frequency you didn't think other people could hear. He came from a completely different background than I did. His family had immigrated from Colombia when he was 8. His father drove a delivery truck. His mother cleaned houses 3 days a week and ran a small catering operation out of their kitchen on weekends. There was no extra money, no safety net, no room for error. He'd been admitted into the AP track through sheer, relentless force of intellect, the kind you develop when you understand early that education is the only ladder you've got access to. He was sharper than anyone I'd ever met, sharper than me, though it took me years to fully admit that. But he wore it quietly, like a card he was choosing not to play yet. We became inseparable inside of 2 months. The friendship deepened the way good friendships do. Not through any single dramatic moment, but through accumulated hours, late nights in his mother's kitchen where she'd make us arepa and ask us questions about our homework with genuine interest. Long drives in my beat-up Civic through the empty city at 1 in the morning, talking about the kind of things that feel too large and too embarrassing to say in daylight. what we were afraid of, what we actually wanted, what we couldn't tell anyone else. He was there the night my father called and told me he was moving to another state, and he didn't say anything. He just sat with me in the parking lot of a gas station while I stared at the windshield, and he understood somehow that silence was exactly right. I was there the night Damien got his scholarship letter, a full ride to State University covering tuition, housing, books. His mother cried at the kitchen table. His father shook my hand as though I'd done something, as though being present for a good moment made me part of it. I remember thinking that I had never felt more purely happy for another person in my life. We went to different universities, but we made it work. Texts every other day, calls on weekends, visits twice a year. The distance didn't erode it. If anything, it clarified what we actually were to each other. In college, you meet a lot of people and most of them are temporary. Damien felt permanent. He felt like architecture, like something load-bearing in the structure of who I was. After graduation, I went into forensic accounting. It wasn't glamorous, but it suited the way my brain worked, methodical, detail-oriented, quietly obsessed with patterns that other people missed. I joined a mid-sized firm, learned the trade from the ground up, spent years developing a specialty in financial fraud detection. I was good at it. Not flashy, not self-promotional, but genuinely skilled in a way that eventually became a reputation. Damien went into business. He had that rare combination of intellectual rigor and social ease that makes certain people almost magnetically effective in corporate environments. He moved through companies quickly, always upward, accumulating contacts and credibility. By the time we were 32, he was a regional director of operations for a logistics firm, managing a portfolio of about 40 million in annual contracts. By any measure, he was succeeding. We were both succeeding, and we were still close, still the same two people from that AP chemistry class, still the ones who could call each other at midnight without apology, still the ones who told each other the things we couldn't tell anyone else. Or at least, that's what I believed. Part 2. The idea that changed everything. It started with an idea. The best disasters usually do. We were 33. I'd been at my firm for 8 years and had quietly built a niche as one of the better fraud analysts in the region. I wasn't partner material in the traditional sense because I'd always been more interested in the work than the politics, which is a polite way of saying I was probably naive about how firms actually operate. Damien had recently been laid off when his logistics company was acquired and restructured, which is the corporate euphemism for we kept the people who played golf with the right executives and eliminated everyone else. He took it outwardly well. Damien always took things outwardly well, but I could hear in his voice something tightening. We met for a long weekend in March, rented a cabin outside the city, hiked during the days, sat by a fire in the evenings. It was the kind of trip we used to take every couple of years to reset, to remember who we were when we weren't performing for our careers and our social circles. On the second night, somewhere around 10 o'clock with the fire burning low, Damien told me about the idea. He'd been thinking, he said, about the structural inefficiencies in mid-market business auditing. He'd spent years watching companies pay enormous fees to Big Four firms for compliance, auditing services that were, in his opinion, often bloated and imprecise, methodologically conservative in ways that actually missed risk rather than identifying it. What the mid-market actually needed, he argued, was a boutique forensic audit and financial risk consulting firm that combined operational insight, his specialty, with genuine technical depth in fraud detection, mine. Not a traditional CPA firm, something new, something built around the actual intelligence of the analysis rather than the prestige of the brand. He laid it out with the kind of organized clarity that reminded me why I'd always admired how his brain worked. He had a market analysis. He had a list of potential anchor clients, contacts he'd developed over a decade who he believed would follow him into a boutique arrangement. He had a business model, a fee structure, a 5-year projection that was aggressive but not unreasonable. "You're the reason this works," he said, looking at me across the fire with an expression I can only describe as completely sincere. "Without your technical credibility, this is just another consulting pitch. With you, it's something different. It's the real thing." I want to be honest about my reaction, because it's important for what comes later. I was flattered. More than flattered, I was moved, because underneath all the business logic, what Damien was saying was that he trusted me, that after everything, after 16 years of friendship, when he was building the thing he actually believed in, he wanted me as his partner. There's a particular vulnerability in that kind of ask that bypasses all rational evaluation. It goes somewhere deeper. I had concerns, I expressed them. My job was stable, my reputation was established. The risk of starting something from scratch at 33 was not trivial. He addressed every concern, methodically, patiently, with the kind of answers that suggested he'd anticipated them all, which he had, I now understand, though not for the reasons I thought. It took me 6 weeks to say yes. I want to be clear that I wasn't reckless about this. I consulted a lawyer. I consulted a financial advisor. I reviewed the business plan carefully. I negotiated the partnership terms, which we put in writing through a proper legal agreement: 50-50 ownership, equal decision-making authority, shared risk, shared reward. I gave notice at my firm, which was uncomfortable and professionally awkward. And we incorporated Marsh and Korea Financial Intelligence in late May 3 years ago. We signed the papers at a conference table in our lawyer's office. Damien shook my hand and then pulled me into a hug. "This is the beginning," he said. He was right. It was. Part 3. Building something real. The first year was genuinely hard in all the ways that starting a business is hard, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. We bootstrapped everything. Modest office space in a shared building. 2 laptops, 1 software license for the analytical platform I couldn't work without, a logo designed by a friend's daughter for $800. We were essentially running on Damien's client network and my technical reputation, which is a precarious combination because neither of those things is guaranteed to convert into actual revenue under the stress of a new relationship. But they did. Damien's relationships were real. I'd wondered privately, in the way that you wonder about things you don't let yourself say out loud, whether his confidence in his network was inflated, whether the contacts he described were actually as warm as he believed. They were. Within 4 months, we had 3 anchor clients, mid-sized regional companies with real compliance needs and real fraud concerns, who found the combination of Damien's operational credibility and my technical depth genuinely compelling. The work was interesting, the fees were fair, the clients were satisfied. I was doing the best work of my professional life. There's something about ownership that changes how you approach work. Not just the financial incentive that matters, but it's not the main thing. It's the fact that every decision you make accumulates into something that is actually yours. I found myself working 16-hour days, not because anyone was making me, but because I genuinely wanted to. I developed methodologies I'd always had in my head, but never had the authority to implement. I wrote white papers, I built systems, I hired our first employee, a brilliant young analyst named Priya, who I found through a former colleague, and who turned out to be one of the best decisions we ever made. Damien was extraordinary on the business development side. He could walk into a room of potential clients and, within an hour, make them feel both understood and impressed. A rare combination. He handled the pitches, the relationship management, the contract negotiations. I handled the technical delivery, the methodology, or the quality of the actual analytical work. We divided cleanly and effectively. It felt like we were actually genuinely built for this. By the end of year one, we had 7 clients, and annual revenue of about $800,000, modest but real, enough to pay ourselves reasonable salaries, cover operating expenses, and begin to build small reserves. Our lawyer reviewed everything quarterly. Our bookkeeper, a woman named Sandra, who I liked immediately for her total lack of patience with sloppiness, kept our internal books clean. In year 2, we started winning larger contracts. A regional bank hired us for an ongoing compliance monitoring program. A healthcare network brought us in to investigate suspected expense account fraud, which we identified and documented in a way that saved them approximately $2 million and led to a successful internal disciplinary proceeding. Our reputation was growing. We were getting referrals. I hired 2 more analysts and we moved into larger office space, a real office now, with a conference room and actual furniture. I remember a Thursday afternoon in our second autumn, sitting in that conference room after a particularly successful client presentation and feeling, genuinely, without qualification, happy. Not the performance of happiness, not the relief of things going better than feared, but actual satisfaction, the kind that comes from having built something real. "We're going to be fine," I said to Damien. He smiled at me. "We're going to be better than fine." I believed him. Right up until the moment I found the first discrepancy. Part 4, the quiet discovery. Here's the thing about forensic accounting that most people don't understand. The skills that make you good at it are not the skills you want to apply to your own life. When I am working on a client's financial records, I bring a specific kind of attention, patient, comprehensive, structurally suspicious, in the way that is professionally necessary. I look for gaps. I look for patterns within noise. I look for the small numbers that are actually big numbers wearing a disguise. I am not good at applying that attention to people I love because the same structural suspicion feels like a betrayal when it's directed at someone you trust, which is why it took me longer than it should have to notice what was happening. The first discrepancy I found wasn't something I was looking for. It was a Tuesday in October of our second year, and I was reviewing our expense reconciliation for the quarter because Sandra had flagged a category total that didn't match her records. Routine, administrative, the kind of thing that 99 times out of 100 is a data entry error or a miscategorized receipt. Except when I pulled the underlying detail, the numbers didn't resolve the way they should have. There was a vendor payment, modest, just under $4,000, to a company called Valor Operational Services, LLC, logged as Technology Infrastructure Consulting. I didn't recognize it. We had no technology infrastructure consulting arrangements at that level. Our IT needs were handled through a simple retainer with a managed services firm that I knew well. I pulled the invoice. It was minimal. Barely 2 paragraphs, a logo I didn't recognize, an address in a commercial mailbox center. I set it aside. I told myself it was probably something Damien had arranged that he'd forgotten to mention. I made a note to ask him. I asked him that Friday, casually, over coffee in the conference room. He glanced at the invoice, nodded, said it was a data security review he'd commissioned after a client mentioned concerns about our protocols. Said he hadn't mentioned it because he didn't want to distract me during the Hargrove financial project, which had been consuming most of my attention that month. "Makes sense," I said, and I let it go because he was my best friend. because the explanation was plausible, because I was not yet in a place where I could look at Damien Correa and activate the part of my brain I use for fraud investigation. The second discrepancy came 6 weeks later, slightly different. Another vendor is Corbridge Advisory Partners, at a fee of $11,000 categorized as strategic business development consulting. Again, no prior discussion, again, minimal documentation. This time I found 2 invoices. When I asked Damien about it, his answer was slightly less specific. He said it was referral related, that he'd used an external contact to facilitate the introduction to one of our larger clients, and the fee was the agreed-upon finder's arrangement. I asked why it wasn't in our operating agreements as a proper referral arrangement. He said he'd set it up informally and that he'd get me the supporting documentation. He was calm, he was reasonable, he didn't deflect or get defensive, he also never sent me the documentation. I waited 3 weeks, the documentation didn't come, and by then something had shifted in me. Not consciously, not dramatically, but the way a weather system changes before a storm, that barometric dropping that animals feel before humans do. I stopped asking myself whether something was wrong and started asking myself what kind of something it was. I pulled every expense record for the past 18 months. I did not tell Damien I was doing this. Part 5. The architecture of what he did. What I found over the course of 11 days, working alone in my home office after midnight, because I couldn't do this where anyone could see my face, was not a single betrayal. It was a system. Let me explain what I mean by that, because the word system is important. A single fraudulent expense is a mistake or a lapse of judgment or a moment of desperation. What Damien had built was structured, deliberate, engineered with the same intelligence he brought to everything else he did. He had established 4 shell entities. I found 3 of them that first week. The 4th took me another 3 months to locate. Each entity had a different name, a different address, a different registration state. Each one invoiced our firm periodically at intervals calibrated to stay below the threshold that would trigger automatic review in our bookkeeping system. A threshold, I realized, with nauseating clarity, that he knew because he'd been in the room when I designed it. The fees were for services that were vague enough to be plausible, but specific enough to appear legitimate. Strategic advisory, operational consulting, business intelligence services, market development support. Each invoice was accompanied by a minimal document, a brief scope statement, a list of bullet points that described activities in general terms. None of them were verifiable, none of them corresponded to actual work. The total, as of the month I discovered it, $412,000. Over roughly 20 months, my business partner, my best friend of 16 years, had been systematically extracting over $400,000 from our company through a network of fake vendors, paid from the business accounts that both of us controlled, quietly and patiently, and with enough structural sophistication that he had clearly been thinking about it for some time. That last part is what I keep coming back to even now. Not the money, though the money was catastrophic for a firm at our stage of growth. It was the timeline, the premeditation, the fact that when he sat across from me at that fire in the mountains and talked about trust and partnership and building something real together, when he said, "You're the reason this works," when he pulled me into a hug in our lawyer's office on the day we signed the partnership papers. He had either already designed this, or he designed it so quickly afterward that there's no meaningful distinction. He had looked me in the face and asked me to build something with him, and he had already decided I was a resource to extract from. I sat at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning with 16 years of friendship stacked on one side and $412,000 of documented fraud on the other, And I understood for the first time in my adult life what it actually means when people say they feel the floor drop out from under them. It's not metaphorical. There is a physical sensation, a vertigo, a genuine physical unsteadiness that comes with the cognitive collapse of a foundational belief. And the foundational belief I had spent 16 years building was that Damien Correa was the one person in the world who would never. He had. Part 6. The weeks after. I want to be honest about what the weeks after discovering this were like, because I think the truth is more complicated than the version of this story where I immediately shifted into strategic revenge mode and executed a perfect plan. That version would be cleaner and more satisfying and entirely false. The truth is that I spent approximately 3 weeks in a state of profound psychological disorientation. I continued going into the office. I continued doing client work, mechanically, on autopilot, relying on the muscle memory of professional competence, while the thinking part of my brain was occupied entirely by what I knew and what to do with it. I sat across from Damien in our conference room and reviewed client materials and answered his questions and asked him questions in return, and the whole time I was watching him from somewhere slightly removed from my body, looking at his face and his easy laugh and his confident posture, and trying to find the thing I'd missed. The tell, the marker, the signal that should have told me who he actually was. I couldn't find it. That was perhaps the most disturbing part. He was exactly the same. Nothing had changed in how he looked at me, how he spoke to me, how he showed up in the friendship. He still texted me on Sundays. He still remembered to ask about my elderly neighbor who'd been having health problems. He still had that quality of complete presence when you were talking to him. That particular attention that had always made me feel, from the first day in that chemistry classroom, like I was genuinely being seen. I started to doubt myself. I went back through my documentation. I looked for the errors I must have made. I triple-checked the entity registrations, the bank records I'd been able to access, the invoice cross-references. I forced myself to construct the most charitable possible interpretation of what I'd found. Maybe these were legitimate services he'd poorly documented. Maybe there was a business rationale I was missing. Maybe I was being paranoid in the specific way that a forensic accountant could become paranoid when they turned their professional lens on personal relationships. Except I had been doing fraud investigation for almost a decade. I knew what constructed vendor fraud looked like. I had testified in court about it. I had written industry papers on identifying it. What I had found was textbook, more sophisticated than average, but textbook nonetheless. There was no charitable interpretation. There was only the thing I'd found. I stopped sleeping properly. I lost weight without intending to. I would be in the middle of a normal activity, grocery shopping or watching something on television or driving home, and a wave of something I can only describe as grief would arrive without warning, and I would have to stop and simply hold very still until it passed. Grief is the right word. It wasn't just anger. Anger would have been cleaner. What I felt was grief, but the grief of losing something irreplaceable, of understanding that the 16 years I'd been certain about were actually built on a question I didn't know was there. There were moments when I thought about simply confronting him, walking into his office and putting the documentation on his desk and watching his face. Part of me desperately wanted to do that, wanted the confrontation, the acknowledgement, the moment when he would have to see that I knew, when the performance would end. I rehearsed it in my head hundreds of times. I didn't do it. I didn't do it because somewhere underneath the grief and the rage and the disorientation, the part of my brain that I'd spent a decade training was still running. And that part knew something important. A confrontation would give him time to move assets, destroy records, construct a story. A confrontation would warn him, and warning someone who has already demonstrated they are willing to build a carefully structured fraud over 20 months is a catastrophically bad strategy. I had to be smarter than my pain, and being smarter than my pain was the hardest thing I have ever done. Part 7. Building the case. I've spent years helping lawyers build financial fraud cases. I know what a prosecutable case looks like, what documentation is required, what chains of evidence need to be established, and, critically, what the weaknesses in a case typically are. That knowledge was now the only advantage I had over someone who was intelligent, careful, and entirely motivated to not get caught. The first thing I did was hire an attorney. Not our firm's attorney, not the lawyer who had incorporated our business, who I liked and who knew both of us, who would be compromised by a conflict I didn't want to create prematurely. I retained a separate attorney, a woman named Carol Brightwell, who specialized in business litigation and partnership disputes. I found her through a referral from a colleague at a firm I'd done contract work for years earlier. I met her at her office on a Saturday when I could be certain Damien wouldn't encounter me, and I spent 3 hours walking her through what I'd found. She was quiet throughout. She asked precise, good questions. When I finished, she said, "This is substantial, and you're right that premature confrontation would be a mistake." We agreed on a strategy. Quietly, over the following weeks, I would expand the documentation, pulling every record I could legitimately access as a 50% partner, establishing the complete paper trail, verifying the shell entity registrations, and following the money as far as I could trace it. Carol would simultaneously begin preparing the legal framework for what would ultimately become a civil suit for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty, and would advise on the question of criminal referral, which in a case of this size and structure was a real possibility. The documentation process took 11 weeks. 11 weeks of sitting across from Damien every working day, having lunch with him twice a week at the same Thai restaurant we'd been going to for 2 years, continuing to perform the friendship that I now understood had been a one-sided arrangement for at least 2 of the 3 years we'd been in business together. Here is what I learned in those 11 weeks. The total theft, once I had complete records, was not $412,000. It was $681,000. There was a fifth entity I hadn't initially located, registered in Nevada, 2 years old, which told me that he had been thinking about this before we even launched the firm. More than that, I found evidence that 3 of our clients, 3 of the relationships he'd brought to the firm and maintained as his personal accounts, had been invoiced for services outside the Marsh and Correa structure. Smaller companies, companies with less sophisticated accounting review, had been paying Corbridge Advisory Partners directly for what they believed were supplementary services from our firm. They were paying Damien personally off-book for work that had been performed by our firm's employees, by my analysts, including Priya, who had no idea. He was not just stealing from the company. He was stealing from our clients through the company, using resources that partly represented my reputation and my team's labor. That is when the grief stopped being the primary thing I felt, and something colder and steadier took its place. Part 8. The dinner. 3 months into the documentation process, Damien called me on a Thursday evening and asked if I wanted to get dinner. Not the usual lunch. Dinner, which we did less frequently, which usually meant something was on his mind. We went to a steakhouse we liked, the kind of place with good lighting and leather booths and a noise level that keeps neighboring tables from hearing your conversation. He was at ease, as he always was. He ordered the good wine. He asked about my sister, who'd recently had a baby. He talked about a new client lead he was pursuing, a regional manufacturing company with a complex supply chain. About halfway through the meal, he grew slightly more serious. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the structure of the firm, about how we're positioned for growth." I said nothing. I waited. He said he thought we should bring on a third partner, someone with a financial connections background who could expand our investor-facing work. He named a candidate, someone I didn't know, a contact from his network. He said the equity arrangement he was envisioning was a 20% stake drawn from both our holdings equally, 10% each. He presented it thoughtfully with the same organized clarity he always brought to business conversations. He had projections, he had a rationale. He was, as always, compelling. What I understood in that moment, sitting across from him in that leather booth, watching the candlelight on his face, was that this was a restructuring move. If a third partner came in, the financial complexity increased. The records became harder to audit. The existing vendor relationships became easier to justify as legacy arrangements. He was building another layer over what he'd already constructed. I smiled. I said it was an interesting idea. I said I'd want to meet the person before forming any view. I said we should discuss it more after the quarter closed. He raised his glass. I raised mine. I drove home that night with my hands perfectly steady on the wheel, and I called Carol Brightwell from my driveway and told her we needed to accelerate. Part 9. The execution. I want to be honest, there is a version of this story where I feel entirely good about everything that happened next, and a version where I feel complicated about some of it. The truth is the version where I feel complicated because I'm not interested in presenting myself as a perfectly righteous person who experienced no moral difficulty. There were moments in the process that followed where I wondered whether I was being measured, whether there was a path towards some kind of private resolution that would be less destructive for everyone. There were moments where I thought about who Damien's mother was, the woman who had made us a rapers on school nights and asked about our homework, and what this would do to her. There were moments where I was tempted to create an off-ramp, to give him a chance to make it right before it became irreversible. But I kept coming back to one thing. He had been given months at a minimum of chances to stop. He had been given the choice every single day to not destroy me. He had chosen every day to continue. And the dinner, the attempted restructuring, had clarified that he would continue until he was stopped. He wasn't going to have a moment of conscience. He wasn't going to come to me and confess. He was going to keep going for as long as I let him. So I stopped letting him. The first step was the civil suit. Carol filed it on a Monday morning, 6 months after I'd found the first discrepancy. A formal complaint naming Damien Correa and the 5 shell entities alleging fraudulent breach of fiduciary duty, conversion, and unjust enrichment, with the full documentation attached as exhibits. The total claimed was $681,000 in direct theft, plus additional damages from the off-book client billing, plus legal fees and interest. The complaint was served to Damien personally at the firm's office at 9:15 in the morning. I was not there when he received it. I was at Carol's office. She called me when her process server confirmed delivery. I listened to that call and said nothing for a long moment. Then I said, "What happens now?" She said, "Now we wait to see how he responds, and in the meantime, we make sure everyone who needs to know knows." The civil suit was public record immediately. Our industry is relatively small. Word moved quickly, perhaps more quickly than it would have in another field, because the specific allegation of financial fraud against a financial fraud consulting firm carries a particular irony that people tend to discuss. I had contacted two of our major clients before the filing to inform them directly and confidentially, the ones I'd identified as victims of the off-book billing, and those conversations were, understandably, difficult. But the clients responded with something I hadn't fully anticipated. They were less angry at the firm than I'd feared, and more willing to cooperate with documentation than I'd hoped. The violations against them had been real. They wanted resolution. The second step was the Professional Licensing Board. Damien had a professional certification through the Association of Business Executives, a credential he'd worked hard for and that appeared prominently on all of our firm's client-facing materials. I filed a formal ethics complaint with supporting documentation. Professional licensing bodies move slowly, but they move. The third step was a conversation I'd been dreading more than any of the others. Part 10. What he did when he knew Damien called me the evening the suit was filed. I was home. I let it ring 3 times, then answered. There was a pause on his end before he spoke. When he did, his voice was different, not the easy, measured tone I'd known for 16 years. Something stripped out of it. Something that, for the first time, sounded like the actual stakes. "Elliot," he said. "Damien." Another pause. "Can we talk? In person?" "We have counsel now," I said. "I don't think that's a good idea." "I'm not asking as—" He stopped, tried again. "Elliot, we've known each other for 16 years. I know. Whatever you think happened, I don't think, Damien. I documented. There's a difference." Silence. "How long have you known?" he asked. And that question, the way it landed, told me everything the documentation had left ambiguous. Not "what are you talking about?" Not "you've got it wrong." Not any version of denial, just "how long have you known?" The acknowledgement of a truth he'd decided not to contest, from a man who had calculated costs and benefits and determined that the cost of a fight he couldn't win exceeded whatever benefit denial might provide. "Long enough?" I said. I heard him breathe. "I'm sorry," he said. And then, more quietly, "I don't expect that to matter." "It doesn't," I said. I ended the call. I sat in my kitchen for a long time. The grief came back, one final wave of it, but it was different now. Not the disorienting kind that makes you unsteady, but the quiet, final kind. The kind that comes when you've already mourned something and are now simply marking the end. Part 11. The Unraveling. The legal proceedings moved across 2 parallel tracks over the following 9 months, and I want to describe what happened to Damien not with satisfaction, or not only with satisfaction, but with accuracy. Because I think what happened to him illuminates something true about the nature of the kind of fraud he'd committed. He tried to fight the civil suit initially. His attorney filed a response that disputed certain characterizations and challenged the evidentiary basis for some of the client billing claims. It was competent legal work, the kind that is designed to create enough doubt and complexity that settlement becomes attractive. I told Carol I wasn't interested in settlement that didn't include full restitution and public acknowledgement of the conduct. We rejected 2 offers. The third offer included both. But by then the professional consequences had already begun accumulating in ways that made the financial settlement almost secondary. His executive certification was suspended pending investigation within 3 months of the complaint filing. The board acted faster than I'd expected, possibly because the evidentiary record was so complete. 3 of the client relationships he'd built for our firm, relationships he'd expected to maintain personally after the firm dissolved, declined to engage with him once the nature of the allegations became clear. Word in our industry moves, as I said, quickly.
He had been positioning himself, as I eventually learned from a mutual contact, to transition into independent consulting using those client relationships as his base. That plan required a reputation he no longer had. The professional isolation is a particular thing to watch from the outside. He was good at what he did, genuinely, technically good, in ways that had nothing to do with the fraud. His competence was real, his skills were real, but trust in this industry is not separable from the professional relationship. You cannot be suspected of fraud against a business partner and a forensic auditor and maintain the kind of trust that business development consulting requires. The market for his specific skills depended almost entirely on people trusting
Him with sensitive financial information. He had made that trust impossible. By the time we reached final settlement, full restitution of the $681,000 through a structured payment arrangement secured against his personal assets, plus legal costs, plus formal written acknowledgement of his conduct. He had no active clients. He had no firm. His certification, once a point of professional pride, was under permanent review. The Colombian restaurant his mother had run out of her kitchen, which she'd expanded into a small catering business over the years, had nothing to do with any of this. I made sure of that. Whatever I was doing, it was to Damien, not to the people he came from. Part 12. Priya, and what I owe her. I have not told you enough about Priya Anand, and she deserves more than a footnote. She was 26 when I hired her, a graduate of a program I respected from a university with a strong analytical track. She had a quality I'd be recognized immediately about that same forensic patience, that attention to structural detail that I'd spent years looking for in analysts. She was also, in the way that the best junior employees are, entirely committed to doing the work right rather than doing it in the way that made her look good in the short term. She had a quiet integrity about the work. When the firm's situation became clear, she was terrified. She had her student loans. She had her immigration status. She was on a work visa, which meant her employment continuity had legal implications that went beyond just income. She had her career, which was at the stage where one catastrophic association can be genuinely difficult to recover from. I called her before the filing. I told her the truth, as much as she needed to know to understand what was coming. I told her that what had happened was nothing to do with her or her work. I told her that the fraud was entirely Damien's, entirely documented, and that her professional record was clean and would remain clean. And then I made some calls. I had spent 8 years building a professional reputation before the firm. I had relationships. I used them specifically and deliberately to make sure that every person in our industry who mattered knew that Priya Anand was exceptional and blameless. Within 6 weeks of the firm winding down, she had 2 offers, one from a regional audit firm, one from a financial services company that had been a former client of mine. She took the second one. The salary was better than what I'd been paying her. She called me when she accepted. She cried a little, which surprised me, and then apologized for crying, which made me laugh for the first time in months. "Don't apologize," I said. "You're going to be great." She is. I check in with her occasionally. She's been promoted twice. Part 13. What happened to me? The firm didn't survive, which I want to be clear about because some versions of revenge stories skip over the cost to make the resolution feel tidier than it is. The fraud had damaged the company's financial position in ways that were recoverable on paper, but not in practice. The reputational disruption of a public fraud case, even one where I was unambiguously the victim, creates uncertainty that client relationships struggle to survive. Some clients stayed, most, understandably, didn't. I wound down the firm in an orderly way over 8 months. I was 35 years old, without a business, with diminished savings, with a professional association to a fraud case that required constant contextual explanation for about a year afterward, and with a wound that had not fully healed. I want to tell you that the revenge made me feel whole. I want to give you the version of this story where watching Damien's professional life collapse provided me with the catharsis it was supposed to. It provided some of it. I am not going to pretend otherwise. There was a night after the settlement was finalized when I sat in my apartment and felt something that was genuinely satisfying, genuinely complete, in the knowledge that what he'd done had not gone without consequence, that the structure of accountability had worked the way it was supposed to, but it didn't replace the 16 years. That's the thing no one tells you about this kind of betrayal, and the thing I've thought about most in the period since. The revenge resolves the injustice, but it does not restore the thing that was taken. What Damien stole from me was not primarily money, although he stole money and I got most of it back. It was the specific confidence that comes from having one person in the world who you are certain about. The absolute certainty that this person is safe. That was the thing I'd carried with me since I was 17 years old. And it was gone, and the settlement didn't give it back. I spent about a year in a state I would describe as carefully functional. I went back to work. Contract consulting initially, then a staff position with a firm that had followed the case and believed my version of it, which was the documented version. The work was good. The people were decent. I was not unhappy, exactly, but I was cautious in a way I hadn't been before, cautious in a way that felt like a new layer over everything, a new baseline distance between myself and the world. Therapy helped more than I expected it to. I say this without embarrassment because I think the particular wound of this kind of betrayal, the specific damage of having been deceived by someone you loved over a long period, while they looked you in the face and maintained the performance of everything you valued about them, requires a certain kind of professional excavation that is hard to do alone. I went once a week for 18 months. I still go occasionally. Part 14. The Letter. I didn't expect. 14 months after the settlement, I received a letter, not an email, an actual letter, handwritten, in an envelope addressed in handwriting I recognized as well as my own. I stood in my apartment hallway for a moment, just looking at it. Then I sat down at my kitchen table and opened it. It was 4 pages. I'm not going to quote it extensively because some of it is genuinely private and some of it I'm still not sure what to make of, but the substance of it was this. Damien wrote that he'd spent a year trying to construct an explanation for himself, a narrative in which what he'd done was understandable given the pressures he'd been under, the financial anxiety he'd carried since childhood, the way that watching our firm succeed had activated something in him that he couldn't name and wasn't proud of. He wrote that he'd spent a long time with that narrative before abandoning it. He wrote that there was no explanation that was not also an excuse. He wrote that he had looked for the moment in himself where it had begun, the first decision, the earliest point of corruption, and that he'd found it, and that it was earlier than I probably knew, and that the knowledge of that had made the last year very difficult to live with. He did not ask for forgiveness. He was explicit about that. He said he understood that forgiveness was mine to give or withhold and that he had no claim on it. He said he was writing because he had spent 16 years being known by me, understood, seen, trusted, in a way that he hadn't experienced with anyone else, and that losing that was the right consequence of what he'd done, but that it was also the thing that had hurt him most, not the professional destruction or the financial settlement, but the specific loss of being known by someone who actually knew him. He said that he hoped I was building something good. I read the letter 3 times, then I put it in a drawer. I didn't write back. I'm still not sure whether I will. The question of forgiveness. Real forgiveness, the kind that isn't performance, the kind that requires something genuine from both parties, is one I haven't resolved. I don't think I need to resolve it to move forward. I think you can hold something complicated without it holding you. Epilogue. What I know. Now, I'm 37 now. I'm a partner at a fraud investigation consulting firm. Not one I built, one I joined, which was a different kind of humbling, a different kind of education in the value of institutions you didn't construct alone. The work is good. The people are ones I trust, which is a statement I don't make lightly anymore. I make it because I've earned the judgment to make it carefully. I have other friendships. Older ones I neglected during the years of building the firm, newer ones I've cultivated with the specific intention of going slowly, of not mistaking intensity for depth, of letting trust accumulate the way it's supposed to, over time, through the small things, not through the drama of shared crisis and mutual investment. I think about Damien sometimes, not as often as I used to, and differently than I did at first. In the beginning, I thought about him with a kind of obsessive surveillance, looking back through the memory of every conversation, every shared meal, every moment of what I'd believed was genuine closeness, running a fraud analysis on the entire archive of 16 years, looking for the signals I'd missed. That phase exhausted me. Eventually I stopped, not because I'd achieved some Buddhist non-attachment, but because I understood that the exercise had a ceiling. I was not going to find the single moment of revelation that would make all of it make sense. The truth was more diffuse than that. The truth was that people can contain 2 things that seem incompatible: genuine warmth and calculated cruelty, authentic affection and structural exploitation. That the version of Damien who sat with me in a parking lot while my father broke my heart was not entirely a performance. I believe that. And that the version who spent 20 months building a vendor fraud network against me was not an aberration that replaced something real. They were the same person. That's the most disturbing and most important thing I know now. It doesn't make the 16 years less real, it makes them more complicated. The case produced one outcome I didn't anticipate. A colleague of Carol's, a prosecutor in the state attorney's office who had been watching the civil proceedings, contacted her about the possibility of criminal charges. The off-book client billing, once the clients provided formal cooperation, created an exposure that went beyond civil fraud into wire fraud territory. I'll tell you honestly, I didn't push for this. I had gotten what I needed from the civil process and had no appetite for a criminal proceeding that would extend the thing for years longer. I cooperated with the investigation when asked, provided documentation when requested, and otherwise stayed out of it. I don't know what ultimately happened with that investigation. I chose not to track it. I made that choice deliberately. Choosing where my attention went was the last form of control I had over how much of my life this was going to consume. What I know is this. I built something real. I built it alongside someone who was taking from me while I built it. And the fact of the taking does not unmake the reality of what was built. My technical work was real. The clients we served were genuinely served. Priya's career was genuinely launched. The methodologies I developed are ones I still use and still stand behind. He did not corrupt any of that. He couldn't. That's the one thing you can't steal from someone who is doing real work, the reality of the work itself. I have a mentor now, a woman I met through the firm who has been doing this work for 30 years and who has a quality of earned steadiness that I find more useful than any amount of inspiration. She said something to me once that I've thought about more than almost anything else. The problem with betrayal is that it makes you think the question was about them. It wasn't. It was always about you, about who you are when the thing you built on turns out to be false. That's the only question that matters, and you get to answer it however you choose. I chose to answer it by rebuilding carefully, by trusting again, slowly with my eyes open, by doing the work without the illusion that the person beside me is guaranteed safe, by accepting that vulnerability is not the same thing as naivety, and that closing yourself entirely is its own kind of defeat that I refuse to give him. I drove past the building where our office used to be a few months ago. Just coincidence. I had a meeting nearby. I hadn't planned to look. But I looked through the car window at the third floor where we'd set up our conference room with the actual furniture and the logo on the glass, and Priya's desk by the window where she liked the afternoon light. There's a different firm there now, different sign, different logo. The thing we built is gone, but I'm still here. Damien is somewhere, diminished and aware of exactly how that diminishment happened and why, carrying the knowledge of what he chose to do with everything I gave him. And I am here, every day, building again. Not because it's easy and not because I've forgotten, but because the alternative, becoming someone who is no longer capable of building, who uses the wreckage of one bad man as an excuse to stop, would be the real victory for him. The one I will not allow. You only get to take what I give you. And I've stopped giving. The ending I live with isn't dramatic. There was no single moment of triumphant reckoning, no scene where I watched him crumble and felt completely whole. Real life doesn't work that way. What happened instead was slower, a gradual withdrawal of everything he'd been living off. My trust, my work, my reputation, my silence. I took it all back piece by piece with documentation and patience and the particular coldness that only operates under grief. And in the end, I didn't just survive him, I outlasted him. That's enough. It has to be. It is.